Hello and welcome to this recording of Behavioral Intervention Plans. My name is Karen Hager Martinez and I'm a course mentor in Behavioral Management and Intervention. So when we talked about the functional behavioral assessment, we talked about identifying the problem behavior and then collecting data so that we could identify the function or what is reinforcing that behavior. And again, that is the student is either gaining access to something or is escaping or avoiding something. So once we've identified the function of the behavior, next we're going to identify a replacement behavior. And that's really the reason we're doing this whole process, is so that we can identify a more appropriate replacement behavior, teach that behavior, and make sure that this student receives reinforcement for that behavior so that the student will then use that behavior instead of the problem behavior. So here are some examples of a behavior and the function and what we might use as a replacement behavior. So if the student is calling out in class and the function is attention, the replacement behavior would be to raise their hand. That should also then result in teacher attention. If the student is throwing the book across the room and the function is escape, then maybe the replacement behavior is that the student should ask for a break, because that results in a brief escape. They're still going to have to come back and complete the task, but they'll get a break in the meantime. So it's very important that we have an actual plan to teach the replacement behavior. Sometimes we think with social behaviors we can just tell the student and then we're kind of finished. We wouldn't ever consider doing that with an academic behavior. We wouldn't just tell the student how to do multi-digit multiplication with regrouping and then think we were done, right? We need to think the same way about social behaviors. We need to actually have a teaching plan. So we need to explain and demonstrate and model the behavior. We need to practice it with the student. We need to give the student opportunities to practice with feedback, and then we need to make sure that we reinforce that behavior. The student is not going to use that replacement behavior if it does not result in reinforcement. So if I've taught the student to raise his hand instead of calling out, but I ignore the student when he raises his hand, he's not going to use that behavior because it won't get reinforced. The student may also continue the problem behavior if it continues to result in reinforcement. So if I've taught the student to raise his hand, but I continue to respond to the student calling out, he's probably going to continue calling out because that's a little bit less effort, right? It's a little bit easier to just call out than it is to raise my hand and wait. So if the student gets attention for calling out, he will probably continue to do that. So what we need to do is put the calling out behavior on extinction. That means that we'll no longer reinforce it. I used to reinforce his calling out behavior by giving him attention. Now I'm not going to pay any attention. I'm not going to provide any attention for the student calling out, but I will make sure that I provide attention for the student hand raising. Remember, when a behavior is first being learned, when it's in acquisition, that first stage of learning, we want a very thick level of reinforcement. So I will reinforce every opportunity. Every time the student engages in the behavior, I will reinforce it initially. Then as the student becomes more fluent at the behavior and is continuing the behavior over a bit of time, so is maintaining it, what I'll do is move to what we call intermittent reinforcement. So I won't reinforce every instance, I'll just reinforce some of them. And at that level, it's actually a better way to maintain the student's behavior. Would not be appropriate when the student is first acquiring a skill, then we do want to reinforce every instance. But once the student has become fluent at this skill and we want the student to maintain it long term, it's actually better to go to the intermittent reinforcement where we only reinforce some instances. We need to really think about how we are going to make sure that the replacement behavior results in reinforcement and that we put the problem behavior on extinction. We're not going to reinforce that behavior anymore. If it's a behavior that goes across settings in schools, then we need a plan to make sure that the behavior is reinforced across settings and that the problem behavior is not. So if it's not just an issue in my class, it's also an issue in some other classrooms or in the hallway or the lunchroom, we need to make sure that any of the adults interacting with the student in those settings know which behavior we're reinforcing and how we're reinforcing it and which behavior we put on extinction. And remember, we can have that plan for a data collection plan on the fidelity of implementation, and these will be some of the things we'll look at. We'll make sure, are the people across all the settings consistently implementing that plan? Are they consistently reinforcing that new replacement behavior, and have they stopped reinforcing the old problem behavior? So then here are the components of the behavior intervention plan. You identify the problem behavior, identify the replacement, the teaching plan, and another thing we haven't really talked about yet is we can identify some antecedent strategies. So these are changes in the environment that are going to make it more likely the student will use the replacement behavior and less likely that they'll use the problem behavior. So for example, if I know that before I have my student sit down to do his math paper, if I know that having him complete the first two problems under my supervision and getting them correct makes it more likely that he will continue then to work on his own, I should do that rather than just sending him straight to a seat to work on it. So that would be an antecedent strategy I could put in, is to get him started on his assignment with my supervision and feedback, so he gets a couple correct, he's feeling confident and successful, and then he's more likely to continue working on his own without engaging in problem behaviors during his math seat work time. We need to identify consequence strategies. So we want to make sure that we're maximizing reinforcement for that new appropriate replacement behavior, and that we are eliminating or minimizing reinforcement for the problem behavior. We need to actually think that through and make sure that we have a plan for it. Oftentimes we're very busy in the classroom, right? You might inadvertently not reinforce the desired behavior, or you might inadvertently reinforce the problem behavior if you don't really have a plan spelled out. So this is our response routine. This is where we kind of spell everything out, so everyone involved knows how they should respond to the student's behavior. So it's a pretty detailed plan. If the student does this, the adult should do that. We should actually, whenever I wrote intervention plans, I carried it as far as, if things went into kind of crisis mode, what should be the response then? Now, if we do the plan well, we shouldn't ever get there, but it's important to have a plan in place, because none of us is necessarily going to think clearly or respond very well in the heat of the moment, so to speak. So it's really best to have, particularly if it's an aggressive behavior or something like that, we want to have a plan identified when we're just sitting around the table calmly and objectively determining the plan. We don't want to come up with a consequence in the heat of the moment. So it's important to have kind of the contingencies figured out for everything that could possibly happen. Hopefully, like I said, we never get into that crisis mode, but if that should happen, we would want to make sure that we had a plan figured out ahead of time. This isn't something that an individual teacher would do. This should be involve the team, and often there should be someone in your district who is a behavioral specialist who can help with this. And again, we don't necessarily want to ever get to that crisis point, but we want to make sure that we have a plan just in case it should happen. The data that we will want to collect then are the progress monitoring data. So we want to make sure that the student is making progress and that the appropriate behavior is increasing and the problem behavior is decreasing. We can then use that to make any adjustments to the plan if we need to. And again, we want to make sure that we're monitoring our behavior, that we're implementing the plan correctly and consistently. And if not, we need to come up with, maybe some additional strategies to make sure the plan is implemented consistently and correctly. So now we're going to come back to Johnny. We talked about him in the functional behavioral assessment recording. If you remember, he started biting his peers and pinching the teacher. So we're just going to give kind of one example of how we might address that behavior with Johnny. So the behavior is biting. The replacement behavior, and we've determined after gathering some more data that Johnny was doing that to get attention. So the replacement behaviors, we're going to teach Johnny how to touch the other student's arm to get their attention. So gently touching instead of biting. So our teaching plan is that we're going to practice that new behavior with Johnny. We're going to give him feedback. We'll demonstrate, we'll model, we'll give him turns to practice with us. Then maybe we'll bring in a peer and practice. And then we'll also provide some support during those first few times that he is in a small group again or working on a group project again to make sure that we can give him some cues to use that new behavior. Antecedent strategies would be to teach the peers how to respond. So if Johnny comes up and touches your arms, you should turn around and say, "Oh, hi, Johnny. Yeah, I'd like you to be in my group. Would you like to come work with me?" So we want to teach them to give Johnny positive social attention when he touches them. So the consequences from the peer for arm touching, the consequences should be attention from the peers for arm touching. So things like eye contact, smiling, talking to Johnny. The consequence if Johnny bites should be that the peer would withdraw. So physically move away, not make eye contact, not talk to Johnny. So no, we don't want them yelling, "No, stop that, Johnny," or "It hurts." Remember, he said that. He has very little language, but he yelled, "It hurts," and laughs. So it seems reasonable that that may be what the students had been saying to him. So we don't want him to get any attention for the biting behavior anymore. This, obviously, since we're working with children, would require some teacher intervention. So you would want to be right there to manage this, to make sure that all attention was withdrawn from Johnny when he was doing the biting behavior. And that would be for a short time, and then we would come back together and let him try again. Again, with some prompts and support from the teacher to use that new, more appropriate behavior, and then to make sure that that more appropriate behavior is given reinforcement, meaning the peers give positive social attention for it. We would want to take data on event recording. We could use event recording of the biting and the arm touching. So we want to see the biting go down to 0, hopefully, and the arm touching, of course, increase. We would also want to do implementation fidelity on whether we were appropriately implementing a plan. So are we giving Johnny the prompts? Are we teaching the peers how to respond? Things like that. So that is a quick run through behavioral intervention plans. You certainly may have questions, so please feel free to get in touch with us. You can use that email there to contact any of the course mentors in behavioral management and intervention.